Hello, everyone. Welcome to the event of non-events and not quite disasters. First of all, I'd like to wish you all a happy International Women's Day. And in service of all women everywhere, we have ensured a very much so male panel for you, or a manel, otherwise known as. But today I'm really looking forward to all the different talks that are going to happen, and then we'll do a question and answer at the end. I think Brady's going to go first now, and then we'll go with Ben and then Peter. But yeah, as they're speaking, feel free to put questions in the chat so you don't forget them at the end. But sure, Brady, take it away.
All right, everybody can hear me and see my screen?
Yeah, all good.
Excellent. All right, so hello, everybody. My name is Brady Podloski. I am a policy analyst in Canada. I work for the disaster recovery branch. So I love disaster recovery, I guess you could say. Today, I'm going to be presenting the potential non-disasters of 2021. So a couple notes. My co-author on this is Alon Kelman. So Alon is a professor of disaster and health at University College London. He's also a professor at University of Agder in Norway, and his overall interest research is about linking disaster and health and integrating climate change into both. So if you want to see any of his work, you can see it at alonkelman.org, or you can catch him on Twitter or Instagram at Alon Kelman. He's a good follow. So now that I've done those plugs, I want to let you know that the results I'm sharing with you today are from a published paper. We published this last September. So everything I'm talking about today will be from this, but also we're working on a second iteration. So there's some things I'm going to include from our new iteration. So I got short 15 minutes with you today, but I want to have two key takeaways that you leave here with. Number one, that we can use potential non-disaster case studies as a teaching tool to get to practitioners, people who don't necessarily like to read disaster literature, and so on. And that our second key takeaway is that potential non-disasters can draw on and reinforce positive disaster risk reduction learnings. So you'll note that both of them have a kind of contingent, I guess you could say, on focusing on positive elements in a disaster. Disasters are otherwise very traumatic, very awful things that can change people's lives. Our intent of going through these non-disasters, potential non-disasters, is not to demean or diminish any of the individuals who have experienced trauma or experienced life-changing event. Rather, it's just a tool, or these case studies are just tools to basically shift the discussion from what went wrong to what went right, what went well during this disaster that made it not a non-disaster. So moving on, overall, there's three research questions our topic comes down to. Number one, can we learn new disaster risk reduction lessons and increase disaster risk reduction awareness by communicating major hazards that did not necessarily become disasters? Number two, what about disasters that should have been worse? And then finally, number three, could non-disasters help teaching and communicating the importance of disaster risk reduction? So I just want to reemphasize point three. I had a really interesting conversation with a practitioner the other day. I started the conversation in classic disaster practitioner fashion, asking, what did you think of the Turkish February earthquakes? Both of them. And the practitioner said, you know what? I don't like to read anything outside of what I'm doing. Any disaster related, any hazard related media, literature, I don't read because it's typically negative, and it typically is what went wrong, and it's sometimes for practitioners, it just doesn't feel good to read that you've done all these things wrong when you know that, oh, well, this went right and this went right. So I thought it was really interesting that a practitioner has kind of pointed out there's not a lot of what went right during a disaster. So again, reinforcing that this topic is looking to point out, well, what went right for some of these potential non-disasters. So you might be asking yourself, well, what is a potential non-disaster? We have two small definitions, and they are evolving over time. They've definitely evolved in our new 2022 paper. But overall, a potential non-disaster is an event where a hazard was evident, but a disaster might not have resulted. Or a major hazard which affected individuals, but not as severely as it should have. So a lot of these potential non-disaster case studies, they can border on the great discussion of, well, when does a hazard become a disaster? If a tree falls in the woods, did it really fall? Did anybody, and it didn't, sorry, if a tree fell in the woods and nobody heard it, did a tree really fall in the woods? Is kind of the old answer or metaphor. I'm forgetting the word right now, but anyways, you get the point. So overall, the term potential non-disasters is evolving, and we're constantly looking to redefine it. A couple notes about the term though. It is not straightforward to say a potential non-disaster, or sorry, a disaster or an event was definitely a non-disaster. We're not really looking to deliberately say this was a non-disaster. These people, they didn't experience anything. That's not really what we're trying to do. We're looking to more so drive a narrative about, well, this disaster could have been worse, and these disaster risk reduction elements were really helpful in diminishing any of the severity or the consequences of that disaster. So again, looking to drive a more of a narrative for talking about what went right during a disaster instead of demeaning or diminishing anybody's experience. So moving on to the next slide. Why does this matter? So what? For me, 2 points. Comes down to being able to communicate new case studies to practitioners. What went right? How can I communicate to people and show them, well, in so-and-so hazard or event or potential non-disaster, they did evacuations extremely well, and it's worth looking into more and critiquing. So the second point I want to reiterate is that we can communicate and apply lessons from these potential non-disasters, and we can really encourage action on disaster risk reduction, which is important. We all want to improve the communities, the cities, the nations we live in, and there are things that are working, but sometimes they don't get pointed out enough. And again, like I noted before, the potential non-disaster term is not straightforward, and classifying things as that were a disaster as a non-disaster, we don't mean to, again, diminish the experiences or the traumas people have felt. We're not looking to intrude on individuals who have experienced a disaster. Disasters affect everybody differently. We know that. So this is a narrative discussion, I guess you could say. So I'd like to get into 2 case studies with you today. So we had 7 in our paper, but I'll just bring 2. The first case study is going to be Australian cyclone. The second is a tropical cyclone in Fiji, Cyclone Anna, and then the Australian cyclone was Cyclone Sarajevo. So we're going to walk through the this first case study, and then we're going to go to one of the lessons learned. So let's get into case study number 1. Cyclone Sarajevo occurred in Western Australia. I have a nice photo of where it occurred. So you can actually see it started between Indonesia and East Timor, and then it had rapid intensification about right there, right around where my mouse is. Made landfall West Australia. So number of towns, number of cities were definitely influenced. Couple major facts. Wind speed on landfall was around 130 kilometers. I forgot to do the translation to miles per hour. I'm so sorry. I don't know. I think it's like 80, 85. It might be a little more. I know kilometers though. Other facts, it made landfall as a category 3 on April 11th. There was about 875 buildings damaged in 2 cities in Australia. 32 of them were beyond repair. 1 fatality due to electrocution from falling power line, though. And after the event, disaster recovery terms, there was about 31,000 insurance claims, of which most of them got insurance money back, were able to fix or rebuild their damaged home. So one of the reasons this is a potential non-disaster is because of how quickly the Australian government acted, or sorry, how they disseminated that there's a cyclone coming and how they acted on the information. So it was very well done. It was a very quick evacuation, which removed all of the people in harm's way out of the city, and then they were able to evacuate. The one fatality was due to a falling power line, and I believe I read the evidence on the fatality is not super clear, but I believe it was a power line worker fixing the power line like afterwards to help restore power to the community. So one fatality due to that. But overall, we would classify this as a potential non-disaster because the evacuations worked so well. There was limited exposure to its civilians, and for a category 3 to have very little damage, very little effect on the human population, that's really good. And then disaster recovery terms, all the buildings were able to be repaired, insurance money, and so on. So again, looking at where it went through, it started in the Sulu Sea, right between Indonesia and East Timor. But on the other hand, for East Timor and Indonesia, it was very clearly a disaster. So you have this really interesting dichotomy of a cyclone, the same cyclone goes through 3 countries and it has drastically different results. So in East Timor, this is the photo. It's a photo taken from the local authorities' police officer's Facebook page. Liquefaction occurred along a lot of the ground and a lot of the streets, and it was due to really intense rainfall and then obviously the wind. So just some facts about what occurred in Timor and Indonesia. The cyclone was not at its highest pace. It wasn't a category 3 at the time. I believe it was at a category 1. But it just occurred so rapidly that people weren't able to adequately evacuate nor prepare. So there's a criticism I found from an Indonesian person and a number of articles that said the Indonesian government never gave us time to evacuate. There was no evacuation warnings, or that they were just too late. So interestingly, we see Australia, who does a very good job of promptly responding and removing all their individuals out of harm's way, compared to Indonesia, where there was 248 fatalities, 66,000 homes damaged, and 510,000 people affected, largely because there was a lot of injuries as well. I just wasn't able to include it, but there was a lot of people affected because exposure was high. The evacuations they weren't the same. And in East Timor, we saw the photo on the next page. It was very evidently a disaster. 33,000 homes were affected, 4,500 homes were destroyed or damaged, and then 41 people died. So that really gets us into our first lessons learned. The same disaster, even the same cyclone, can produce different results for different people, but also different nations. So it's these 2 lessons that I'm going to share with you, they are very novel. Like they're really original, foundational disaster risk reduction lessons that we all learn in the beginning, or that we all think about and talk about. One disaster occurs to 3 different nations. All 3 nations have different results. And I think it's interesting that with the use of evacuations, we saw 3 different fatality numbers. Higher exposure to a disaster oftentimes leads itself to more severe consequences. So even though Cyclone Sarajevo made landfall as a Category 3 in Australia, the cyclone was not as severe. The I guess you could say the wind speed and the flooding amount in Timor and Indonesia was actually less than it was in Australia, yet the results were drastically worse. So quite a few lessons to be learned, but we just wanted to draw your attention to this one, that disasters will produce different results in different nations. So on our second case study, our final case study, it's occurred in January 20th, 2021. I apologize, not 2020, 2021. And so tropical cyclone Anna hit Fiji January 20th. Some facts about it: it made landfall as a Category 2. The inception of it was January 20th, made landfall on January 30th, and then it dissipated about February 1st or 2nd. It hit Fiji's major islands. So a lot of the damage was actually from storm surges attributed to the wind. So the storm surges flooded inland and then caused infrastructure and agricultural damage. A Category 2 was still destructive to the main Fijian island, but overall there was 2 fatalities. There was limited homes damaged. In fact, we couldn't find a number that was, I guess you could say, like referenced enough that I felt comfortable using. So, but it was a low number. And the reason we categorize Cyclone Anna as a potential non-disaster is because 14,000 people were evacuated to 422 evacuation centers. So we saw a major cyclone, Category 2, albeit, hit a island which has a high population for such a low space and a low population density. So high population density. Yet the evacuations, again, as they were in Australia, were really effective in reducing the exposure rate to people. So I thought the Fijian government, from the things I've read and the reports, the after action reports, they did a really good job responding promptly and opening up evacuation centers to people who wanted to go. Interestingly enough, Cyclone Anna occurred 45 days after Category 5 Cyclone Yasa. So the Cyclone Yasa occurred in 2020, and it was extremely destructive. So for the Fijian government to be able to prepare the people for a lesser disaster, in quotation, is really good. They some of the things they did were good. So as you see on the next slide, this is kind of the path it took. So it started in its inception was on the 20th, and then it made its way to the main islands in Fiji, and it intensified throughout there. So interestingly enough, the second lesson, last lesson for you today, is that the collective experiences of individuals and of communities and groups of people significantly influence preparedness. So we know that tropical storms typically are an indication of wind speed, not flooding potential, although flooding potential can be recorded and told by the media to people, like, oh, there's going to be a lot of rain, so you make sure that you're watching out for flooding, or that there's flood warnings, which there was in Fiji at the time. But interestingly, for some people in Fiji, it was perceived as not being that bad because it was only a Category 2. Many Fijians, not many, some, had a sense of not invincibility, but that this Category 2 wasn't going to be that bad. I had just experienced a Category 5 45 days ago, a month and a half ago. I can get through this Category 2, no problem. And in fact, we had 2 fatalities. One of them, the story that I've read that is publicized in a lot of places for preparedness, is that an individual actually went swimming as the cyclone made landfall, because people around them said, well, they didn't think it was going to be that bad, even though it was a category 2, and people were still going to evacuation, still going everywhere like that. So yeah, the second lesson that I'll leave you with today is that the collective experiences are significantly influenced by individuals. Collective experiences influences individuals' preparedness. So overall, I hope you leave here with 3 things: that you have a greater understanding in the potential non-disasters. And we hope that you see these case studies and that they're studied more often. And we hope that you learn some of the positive disaster risk reduction learnings that we can get from these potential non-disasters. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Brady. That was so interesting. And I think the sort of potential non-disasters is going to be a really good teaching tool for sure. Thank you again. And if we can pass on to Ben, is that okay?
That's great. Thank you, Tilly. And thanks for the invitation. I'll just share my slides. Just give me a moment. Tilly, I think you might have disabled participant screen sharing.
I've just made you co-host. Should
Cool.
work now. Cool.
Okay, as I said, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation, Tilly. I want to talk on a different kind of register today. I want to talk about the problem of boredom in relation to climate change, or put differently, the problem of taking an event which is taken to be the event, the kind of horizon of thought, that which disrupts many of our categories, and think through its politics, the politics of being bored in relation to climate change, of remaining unaffected or disaffected in the midst of increasingly intense calls for urgent action in the present, increasingly apparent but unequally distributed effects. What does it mean to meet those calls, inhabit that urgency with the stilling and the slowing that is boredom? And I want to use a series of speculative reflections on the relationship between boredom and climate change as a way in to think this category of the non-event. And I think I'm going to think it in a different kind of register than Brady. For me, the category of non-event is interesting precisely because it sits outside of some of the ways in which we think of events. So typically, so non-event does not equal the opposite to an event. So if we think about the term event, how it's typically always already comes kind of freighted with a term that is other to it. So event and the everyday, event and structure, event and condition, event and process. They're taken to be the other two, whatever event is. Non is a different kind of term. The term non before event implies a particular kind of mode of eventfulness, rather than the opposite to event or the other to event. So beginning from that reflection, I want to build upon it by talking through what events become when received in and through boredom. I want to begin with a quote, a fairly typical one by those who govern or those who are concerned with climate change. The quote is basically a sort of urgent claim that the language that surrounds climate change, or at least some of the language, bores. And that boredom is a problem because it interrupts the relationship between climate change as a kind of experiential but also mediated phenomenon and action. And so the boredom or presumed or projected boredom of others becomes a kind of challenge to the necessary action that is needed in the shadow of the event of climate change. But this is not the only time in which boredom is present in relation to debates around climate change. Boredom exists almost as a kind of spectre or a kind of public secret, something which might be present in everyday experience, unequally distributed, of course, but may be present as we scroll past another image of a burning planet, as we register a placard's demand that we act now with mild indifference, perhaps. Of course, who is the subject of boredom or subjected to boredom remains in question. But nevertheless, there's a kind of sense, a kind of sort of mood that perhaps climate change is registers through the body, through affects which impede action in some form. But of course, this is not necessarily how the kind of like the wider kind of affective or emotional field of climate change is currently discussed. In an emerging literature on the kind of affects or emotions of the emergent disaster or to come catastrophe that climate change is, a whole range of kind of present and emerging emotions or affects are named, are evoked, but what they all have in common is a presumption of the affection of climate change, a presumption that climate change is present through its mediations. It's present in a way that moves subjects, and as subjects are moved, as they feel what gets named as climate terror, as they are imbued in climate grief, climate change becomes an event through that process. It becomes something which takes on the qualities that events have, the doubled qualities of disruption and the creation of the possibility of something new. Now, in and against this background, boredom becomes other to this production of the event. Boredom is that which, I will go on to argue in the remaining limited time, produces temporarily climate change as a non-event. What do I mean by this? I mean that what strikes us today about climate change is not necessarily that it is discussed in terms of a disaster or it's discussed in terms of a catastrophe. What characterizes climate change today is that our genres for naming and knowing events break down in relation to it. So climate change is simultaneously named and known through many of the genres that we use to describe events: disaster, catastrophe, emergency. At the same time as we use those kind of those old genres, new genres are being invented to kind of name the event or the condition that climate change is. Examples include the idea of ordinary disaster, the idea of slow violence. They'll be very familiar to most of this audience. They're all in different ways attempts to kind of undo the line between event and condition, event and structure in some ways. But at the same time, as climate change is subject to this kind of multiplication of new and old modes of eventfulness, at the same time, there's a sense that these genres fail in some way or another, that they can't do justice to the kind of event that climate change is. So in the midst of this kind of genre confusion, in the midst of this genre multiplication, the claims that others are bored of and by climate change takes us in a different direction. It takes us not from the question of what is the event of climate change, but how climate change as non-event is produced. What do I mean by this? I mean, a non-event is produced when an occurrence is drained of the possibility of either disruption or of some kind of change. When some kind of occurrence is presumed to demand or result in no positive or negative change. Or to put in more kind of conceptual terms, a non-event is when an occurrence has neither threat nor promise. My argument in the remaining time, which is rapidly running out, is that by thinking from boredom as a temporary way in which climate change is produced as a non-event, i.e. it's drained of possibility, and it's produced as an occurrence without threat or promise, This leads us to notice a new form of detachment from climate change, what I'm terming climate change suspension, which is different to climate change denial and is different to what I'm calling climate change delay. Climate change suspension, which follows from producing climate change, not as the event, but as a non-event. Second, I'll go on to argue that we can understand a lot of the ways or a lot of the claims that are made today that we should find new ways of representing climate change, better climate stories in Rebecca Solnit's work, whole genres of like climate fiction. We can understand all that as occurring in the context of climate change suspension, because what it all attempts to do is recreate climate change as an event which demands some form of action. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts on boredom and the non-event. I might skip part B, we'll see how things go in the remaining time. So proposition 1, climate change suspension. Boredom's interesting, and it's interesting to talk upon it, partly because it surfaces very often intermittently. For some forms of life, it can exist as a kind of structural condition of existence, something like an atmosphere, but other forms of boredom surface intermittently. And for me, boredom involves a very particular relation. It involves some kind of proximity. Think about when you're bored in relation to something, perhaps a lecture on climate change boredom. Think about when you're bored in proximity to something. A relation of boredom allows you to maintain proximity to that thing, whilst at the same time detaching from some kind of promise that that thing could embody. So you lose interest, you lose engagement, you lose the kind of the quality of being enlivened, whatever it might be. But boredom as a relation, as a kind of affect structure, is this felt detachment from within proximity to something. So what it produces, if we think about when and where it surfaces in relation to climate change, is a continued proximity to climate change as mediated, by which I mean climate change as an event primarily, although not exclusively, represented through the genre of emergency and that claim of urgency, which is central to emergency. It revolves around a felt detachment from proximity, but also a turning away. Boredom is a strange thing, because what boredom does, it allows us to begin a beginning. You get bored by something, turn away from it, even if your mind just wanders, and something else starts again. So my argument in relation to climate change in a longer piece of work, which should be coming out later this year, is that what becoming bored momentarily with climate change does is two things. First of all, it allows continuation of the attachment to the promises which are organized around fossil fueled lives, number one. In other words, you can turn away from the demand of change. You can turn away from the claim of damage existing or to come. But secondly, at the same time, which makes climate change boredom ambivalent, what it also allows for is a way of coping with the overwhelming. So boredom as and the disaffection of boredom as a way of coping and being able to kind of continue through the almost like the too much, the overwhelming that is associated with climate change. And what this kind of detachment, which is an ambivalent detachment because it enables the continuation of fossil fueled forms of life, whilst enabling subjects to kind of inhabit a present which doesn't become overwhelming. What that does is produce what I term climate change suspension. It doesn't eliminate the event of climate change. It momentarily produces it as a non-event, as something which doesn't demand some form of change on our part, or demand some form of empathetic relation to the suffering of human or non-human lives. Instead, the demand of climate change is temporarily suspended. Climate change becomes a non-event. That is, to return back to my initial definition of what a non-event is, an event which is drained of possibility and therefore is no longer present as either felt threat or felt promise. It becomes nothing much at all, something to be turned away from. So climate change is suspended. Momentarily, it's not ended. And that's important. Now, importantly, this production of climate change as non-event makes it really different from, I think, two other formations which exist today for exiting the demand that climate change places upon us. So climate change suspension as the production of the non-event is different to, first of all, climate change denial, or what Clara Daggett terms climate change defiance or refusal. So that's the kind of intense disagreement that climate change exists as a problem and we should do anything about it. Now, what climate change denial does is it exits climate change as the event by claiming that the big threat is not climate change, but it's all the action done in the name of climate change. But it retains a kind of melodramatic structure, to use Anker's understands of melodrama. It retains a melodramatic structure, climate change denial. Because what it does, effectively, it says that everything is at stake in the present, not because climate change is real, but because action in relation to climate change threatens something valued. So an event is still produced in climate change denial. But it's also different, this is climate change suspension, it's different to what I'm terming climate change delay, which is the acceptance that climate change places demands upon us, but there's a kind of equivalence in climate change delay between climate change and other events. It's the language of kind of trade-offs. It's the language of, well, we've got to kind of, we can't stop growth. It's the language which says climate change is not the event, but it's one of a number of possible events. So climate change suspension as the production of the non-event as different to climate change denial and climate change delay, which for me are all ways of exiting a particular way of thinking about climate change. But of course, and what's interesting about climate change suspension is in the name, suspension. Something is held in suspension, but the demand of climate change as mediated through the language of emergency with its affect of urgency, it returns. A trace of climate change, intensified concern emerges in the context of people's lives. What is produced is perhaps not best thought of as boredom, effectively, but perhaps something like boredoom, where a sense of catastrophe coexists with a kind of felt indifference. Cheyenne Nagai's brilliant book called Ugly Feelings, there's a concept of sublimity, which is basically how the sublime and boredom kind of coexist in relation to certain kind of events. And what this does is produce climate change as simultaneously a non-event and an event, sort of like affectively at the same time. Okay, I think I've reached my time. I'm gonna not talk about the second kind of proposition, which basically understands loads of climate change discourse at the minute around the sort of desperate hope of producing affected subjects who exit their indifference, be it boredom or apathy, exit their indifference by being newly affected by both the threat of climate change and the promise that action can make a difference. So loads of different, the use of art in basically to move subjects. For me, this is all about the attempt to produce passionate subjects who feel again the event of climate change. But I can talk about this like at a different time, or people can read the work if they like. Okay, so some concluding comments. So for me, the non-event is not the other two events. The non-event is a temporary state that any occurrence can potentially move through. By which I mean that it's one of a number of what I'm terming modes of eventfulness, which coexist with any given society, which is ways we have of handling and making sense of that which disrupts actually or threatens to. So disaster as mode of eventfulness, emergency, which I've written a bit about as mode of eventfulness, catastrophe, incident, etc., etc. Non-events as mode of eventfulness, climate change suspension as, and then so that's the general argument, and then climate change suspension as the other to denial or delay, where a temporary non-event is produced, which for me explains a lot of the contemporary politics in somewhere like the UK of climate change. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben. Amazing. Really appreciate that. Yeah, and I wasn't bored, so that was good. I'll pass on to Peter if you want to share your screen. I think I've made you a co-host.
Yeah, I think we did that at the start.
Thank you.
Is that working? Yeah. Yeah, so thanks Tilly for the invite. Really looking forward to this. And actually, as I mentioned to Tilly, it kind of has dovetailed well with some stuff that I've been working on anyway, and like some things that I've been thinking about over the past few months. So since September, I'm a lecturer in development geography, Oxford Brookes University. And before that, I was based at King's, did my PhD at King's College London. So actually was just gonna, I need to rethink my situation here because I've got, need to turn my presenter view off if you just bear with me a sec because my notes have disappeared. Just gonna stop sharing for a sec. I've got a monitor and it's So anyone got any tips on how I can make sure that my monitor doesn't show the same presentation?
I'm not very good at that.
Did that work? No.
Yeah, that's good.
No.
That's good.
Yeah, no, it's not. Let's see if this works. So are you still seeing my PowerPoint?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so what I might do instead is instead of just going to PowerPoint, I'm just going to click through my slides manually.
Yeah, do that.
Cool. So what I was saying was I've been thinking about some of these issues anyway. One of the things I've been doing this term is designing and teaching a module called Disasters Development in Society. And I've been trying to think of ways to engage with and get students to think about, you know, all the different various debates and ideas and theories that constitute the field. And so a couple of weeks ago, inspired by this podcast, Disasters Deconstructed, which some of you may be aware of, I think one of the episodes, you know, quite a while ago was set up ostensibly as a debate between whether disasters should be understood as events or processes. And so one of the lectures, we had that as a theme, and we actually had a class debate about whether, you know, one side was arguing whether disasters should be understood as events, and one should be arguing they should be understood as processes. We didn't really get to an answer because both teams seemed to think they argued their point so well that when we had a vote at the end of the session, the decision was 50-50, with those who were arguing that they should be framed as events voting that way, and vice versa with the process argument. So I don't know what that says, but it was certainly interesting. And anyway, it raised loads of interesting questions, and we found it was like a useful way to engage with and think about lots of different issues across the field. So in that debate, so these are some of the slides that I was putting up beforehand or afterwards to try and, you know, put forward why is this an important issue, why is this an important debate to have. So the first half of that is like, so what is the problem? Why shouldn't disasters be framed as events? Because sort of intuitively, they do sort of seem and appear evental or like events. But over many years, obviously, disaster scholars have argued that disasters aren't events, but are processes. They're sort of either component parts of or outcomes of long-term processes. And this event framing can actually lead to problematic policy responses. It can think of disasters as short-term things that need a short-term response. It can conceal or overlook the sort of long-term political and social construction of risk. And it also kind of leads to a kind of focus on the natural hazard rather than the vulnerability. I thought about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about my PhD research later, but one thing that I was kind of thinking about in terms of that short-term response when I was thinking about that in relation to landslides was that what I found was that conditions of landslide vulnerability don't necessarily relate to the event as such, but kind of emerge more from a long-term imposed inability to move on or adjust to a material event or reality of a loss of land, which people find it hard to recover from in the long term, rather than the kind of often, the kind of short-term slope failure itself, which obviously can have catastrophic consequences, but the impacts also resonate beyond that moment. But then on the other side, you might be thinking, well, how did the people argue that, sometimes we should understand disasters as events, and is there a benefit to that? And also sort of intuitively arguing that, in some ways they are maybe best defined or understood as events. Perhaps that that's a more intuitive framing, and that, even if you think about events as the intersection between hazards and vulnerabilities, a kind of intuitive event framing where those two things come together can be a useful entry point to get people to think about how disasters aren't just natural, but related to other kinds of issues as well. And I think, as Ben alluded to, and which we'll discuss later, there's also this idea that event framings have some kind of political potential, and that they might kind of motivate or inspire action to address long-running processes and long-term processes which cause problems. More generally, I'm actually, at the moment, recently, I've been writing up a chapter for a book on basically disaster risk research, and my chapter is talking about the links between disasters and idea that many of you are familiar with, but many won't be, which is assemblage theory. If you're not, then fear not, because there'll be a chapter out soon which can explain what it is and how it relates to disasters. But nonetheless, in that chapter, I've actually, one of the sections that I've talked about is precisely this. So I'm talking about assemblage theory and disasters and how it can discuss and speak to this tension between understanding disasters as events or processes. And so I've just got a little bit on that, which I thought I'd share. So that disasters should be understood as either outcomes of or parts of long-term social, economic, political, biophysical, and cultural processes is now generally taken as given in critical disaster studies, much like the consensus that disasters are not natural. But nonetheless, event framings of disasters are still commonplace outside of the subdiscipline of disaster studies and associated disciplines. So these framings are often frequently seen in mainstream media outlets, physical science studies of disasters, and other academic fields that engage with disasters tangentially, maybe in relation to wider theories of politics, economics, culture, and science. Furthermore, and as Guggenheim and I think just Guggenheim in 2014, in a kind of paper on sociology and disasters, pointed out that disasters are often experiences as events or ruptures that are generally viewed as originating beyond the realm of what we might know as the social. They also tend to represent a break in people's lives as they were, or at least a moment in time through which people come to narrate and view their lives so far. So speaking of disasters as processes, and primarily in terms of their social origins, as many critical disasters do, will often alienate scholars of other disciplines and also non-scholars. And that kind of process framing might lead us to overlook some of the most important social aspects of disasters, namely, why is it that persistently disasters are viewed as natural events? Recent scholarship on disaster studies would suggest that instead of this kind of binary view, we should maybe see the temporal framings of disasters and the politics inherent in them as objects of study in themselves, rather than just frames through which disasters are understood by critical disaster scholars. And I'm thinking there's been quite a lot of discussion and debate around this idea of like the temporalities of disasters. I don't know if anyone else has come across this. So I've seen like a number of special issues. I think there's one in International Journal for DRR. I think the RGS session that Tilly and I were in last year, although a lot of the ostensibly the abstract weren't necessarily about temporalities, a lot of the discussion and the debates kind of moved towards this is an emerging area of research. And what I sort of mean by that, so there's some other people who've been talking about and thinking about this, and this is a paper that I read and really, when I was first trying to grapple with the issues during my PhD particularly, I found this description of this analysis of the Christchurch earthquake by Cloak and others really interesting and useful in terms of thinking about the temporalities of disasters. And in some ways, how Ben said, the kind of both sides that disasters can be kind of events and processes at the same time. And they talk about how the earthquake as an event appeared to give political visions and political organizations and movements and momentum in a way that wasn't previously possible. And so they use a Bedouin framing to kind of talk about how the event in that sense is not just a mappable moment in time, but an occurrence that is ongoing and people continue to relate to, and that therefore keeps the event going, I suppose. And the term that I really liked from that was this idea of disasters being continuing events. So, you know, in that sense, you kind of keep the political potential, perhaps, of what an event can be and what it can, what actions it can give rise to. But then there's also, you might be able to move past the idea that it's just a kind of one-off moment in time, which removes or takes our focus away from the long-term processes that contribute to it. So just to kind of give, you know, I've talked about one example there in one paper that's discussed these temporalities. I'm also would like to just kind of then tie this in to think about and discuss how I use these ideas in my recent PhD research. And I guess that research and the findings from it were kind of one of the motivations or one of the reasons I've ended up discussing and thinking about these issues so much. So my PhD research I did in 2019 into 2020, just before COVID, very fortunately. And there's lots more I could say about that, but primarily my main data collection process was working with a research assistant who I met there and who I published a paper with last year or 2 years ago about how you know, the research wasn't really possible without him, and how we worked together to kind of get both, not necessarily like his local perspective, but how working with him allowed me and allowed us to gather lots of different perspectives of people who live locally to where landslides happen. And we kind of ended up framing those interpretations and perspectives against the perspectives and the framings that might be seen in kind of the ways in which disasters are responded to and landslides are responded to. And just to kind of give a flavor of what that looked like, sorry, that's not what I wanted to do. I was gonna, so actually this bit that I'm gonna read is actually it's the kind of anecdote that I used to open my thesis, and it really speaks to this dissonance between disasters as events or disasters as processes, and also the politics of events or non-events in this case. So in January 2020, towards the end of the fieldwork, Lo Chan and I visited a block development office in a place called Gorobatan, which is right down here. So we were staying up in Kalimpong, the town here, and this Gorobatan place is about 4 or 5 hours drive away, and we'd been invited or told to visit there by the district authority and the headquarters, and we were basically going around to speak to people involved in disaster management to discuss how they respond to disasters and, you know, their experience of landslides in the area. So the most senior figure, as I said, the district magistrate, had put us in contact with the person who was covering the vacant block disaster management officer role in Gorobatan. We were hoping to speak to them ahead of visiting some landslides in the block as well and speaking to people there. And we phoned on the drive over. They said they were completing disaster management training in the nearby city, the regional city. But if we went there, someone else would be very happy to help us. When we arrived, the most senior official in the office spoke to us instead. They provided us with a district disaster management plan and some information on landslide areas in the block. when we asked them, they said they didn't think any landslides had occurred in the previous monsoon season, and that they're not really as common in this particular region because it's a bit lower down, not as mountainous than the rest of the district. The next day, we visited some villages a few hours drive from the town and the office in the low eastern Himalayan foothills, only a few hundred meters above sea level. These pictures kind of give an indication of that. And we spoke to one man who had recently actually been affected by a landslide in the 2019 monsoon season. So the previous season to when we basically the same season in which the block officer had told us that no landslide had happened. In fact, this person had been affected by one. So he said he'd recently built his own house with funds from a tribal development board on a small patch of land at the bottom of the valley. The landslide was triggered by heavy rainfall and destroyed his soon-to-be harvested cash crops, one of which was cardamom, which requires a lot of water to be farmed. And also the new house was cracked and made unsafe for habitation, which is actually the one you can see in the top left picture there. So the village cooperative had helped the family to relocate to a nearby rented property, and the local officials had provided some rations and some tarpaulins in the immediate aftermath of the landslide to respond to that through their disaster management kind of policies and practices. He told us he wasn't educated, but told us that his brother-in-law was trying to lobby the local panchayat for some more compensation and some kind of way to help him adjust to this problem. But 6 months after that landslide, he was still dealing with the fact that he'd lost a lot of his land, which he relied on for his livelihood, and also that year's cash crop. When we asked him what he was thinking of doing next, he wasn't sure. And then we also visited another house nearby who had faced a similar issue on a slightly smaller scale, but who had been suffering from soil erosion and small landslides for many years. And so I use this anecdote in my thesis and here to kind of basically point to a couple of questions. And this is basically how landslides are perceived and experienced by different people, and how and why events such as landslides come to matter for some people and not for others. So basically, how is it that this person is dealing with the long-term processes and the impact of this event of a landslide, whereas some of the officials weren't aware that landslides had even occurred in that particular year. So this anecdote shows a dissonance between the landslide victims' experience of a landslide process and the perception of landslide events held by state officials and the policies that they subscribe to and work with. And so these disconnects speak to different theoretical questions, in terms of, who decides when something is or is not a disaster, how can disasters be prevented, or more simply, what exactly is a disaster? So just had a few sort of concluding thoughts on that basis. So we know from disaster studies and decades of disaster research that disasters are not necessarily events, and from a kind of objective standpoint, they might be best understood. But nonetheless, there's this kind of persistent event framing and this kind of intuitive way of seeing disasters as something that are evental and have event-like qualities. And in some ways, I think we shouldn't ignore the politics of disaster events, because, as Ben said, events require some sort of political action, or that event is a means to a political intervention. But some do not have the means to make that claim. So some people don't have the means to say that this is an event which requires support and an intervention, whereas some people do have that power to make that claim. So in that way, I kind of argue that there's need to develop a way of thinking about disasters that captures both their evental and processual nature. And that's something that I've been trying to work on and develop. So in a paper that I published with one of my PhD supervisors, Amy Donovan, and also in this chapter and also in my thesis, I've been thinking about this concept of disasters in the making. And the main idea of this concept is it invites disaster scholars to consider both the making of disasters in the well-established sense of disaster risk creation, in terms of how they, are made over long periods of time and how they are the outcomes of the way in which we've made particular processes, but also their making with respect to how causality, temporality, and the impacts are deployed rhetorically to make disasters into political devices following the event of their emergence. So there's kind of the two sides of it, where we acknowledge that disasters are processes and made over time, but also the way in which disasters are made and reproduced and related to after their occurrence. And so a couple of other questions just kind of relating to what Ben and Brady had said. A question that popped into my mind is, what is the politics of potential non-events, and how do potential non-events still inspire the same kind of action that events might, or disaster events might, and what are the implications of kind of the political incentives for disaster risk reduction? Or more simply, are potential non-events too boring? You know, do they not inspire that kind of political action the same way that disaster events do? Or I guess, what is the political will to ensure that non-disasters become the norm, which is ultimately the outcome, or the thing that all disaster scholars are apparently working towards, is the elimination of disasters. And so non-events seem to be our ultimate endpoint, but like, what are the political implications of that? So yeah, I think that's my piece, and looking forward to hopefully some discussion and Q&A.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. Really looking forward to that chapter, and your paper with Amy has been fundamental to my scholarship. So thank you.